Breaking overnight, attempted evacuations finally resuming from the eastern part of Aleppo. Remember, conservative estimates put the number at 50,000. 50,000 innocents are caught in a war zone. However, as they tried to start these evacuations, there was fire directed at the civilians in these evacuation vehicles right in the middle of a devastated area. Now, supposedly there's a new ceasefire taking effect overnight, but the word is it's barely holding. With us is the counterterrorism expert, Daveed Gartenstein-Ross. Daveed is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It's good to have you with us. Daveed, we're trying to get people to connect to what's going on in Syria, not simply just because, although it should be enough, that it's a humanitarian catastrophe, but there are real strategic and safety implications to the United States and other countries from what's going on there right now. I want to play you some sound that gives us context for the decision the U.S. has made to stay out. This is from President Obama, most recently talking with Fareed Zakaria about why he did it.
Do you think it is an accomplishment of your presidency that you have substantially kept the United States out of the Syrian civil war militarily?
I think it is the smartest decision from a menu of bad options that were available to us.
Do you agree?
Well, if you look at what Obama went on to say, I have a problem with the overall statement, but I don't disagree with the decision for intervention, for avoiding intervention. What he went on to say was, we can't put 150,000 troops in Syria like we did in Iraq. And the problem I have with that is it's a complete straw man of what the positions are. I mean, what Hillary Clinton, for example, advocated, and some people who were close to Obama, was a humanitarian strip where a no-fly zone would be enforced in the northern part of Syria, humanitarian corridors. There are other options short of putting 150,000 troops in there. But overall, given the difficulties of the Syrian war, given how many sides there are and how many people would like to target the United States, as well as the very amorphous U.S. interests, I do think he made the right decision.
All right, and you just mentioned something that is going to hit on a vast field of ignorance for most of us here in the U.S. Who is involved in fighting in Syria? Most people believe it's at best Assad against those who want to be liberated from him, but it's far more complex. We have a graphic, and I want you to take us through just how many different entities are taking place on the ground here. Take us through the different parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, I helped your producer set this up yesterday, and this is a simplified map. So over in Aleppo, you have Sunni rebels against Assad's forces, and it's not just Assad's forces. It's also the Iranian government, it's the Russians, as well as Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese militant group that is sponsored by Iran. Now, another area of concern is that the Sunni rebels do have a significant jihadist contingent among their ranks, including al-Qaeda, over in Aleppo. In the Golan Heights recently, you had some ISIS fighters actually attack Israel. Israel fought back. Then that's on the Assad versus the Sunni rebels side of the equation. Then when you look over at the other side of the country, the eastern side of the country, you have the ISIS side of the equation, where on the one hand in Raqqa you have, that's the capital of ISIS's so-called caliphate. And there you have ISIS fighting against a kind of hastily assembled coalition. It includes the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the YPG, which is a Kurdish group, which is also a group that is linked to the PKK, an anti-Turkey Kurdish group. And so in addition to the pressure on Raqqa, you've also had the Kurds and Turks fighting each other. Then the final thing, looking down to the south, is Palmyra, which ISIS just retook from the Russians and the Syrian forces as they beat a hasty retreat. One of the reasons they were able to do so is because of the focus on Aleppo. So this is a multi-sided conflict where you have basically the Assad problem set and the ISIS problem set. And that's what, again, to defend the president's decision, makes any sort of intervention so dangerous. There's multiple factions fighting each other in complex ways and a lot of people who would love to kill Americans.
So the president decided, let's stay out of that because it's too much of a morass, and we'll make gains against ISIS elsewhere. And thus comes their reckoning that they've killed a huge fraction of ISIS fighters. How can they know how many ISIS fighters they've killed or how many are left?
The answer is that they don't. The U.S. intelligence estimates, in my judgment, have always been low. If you go back to 2014, U.S. intelligence was saying that there's between, some of the low-end estimates were 9,000, but the mainstream estimates within the intelligence community were 18 to about 33,000 fighters. Now, I have an article, I'm on the record, critiquing that figure back then, arguing that the numbers were actually much higher. And I think that what I wrote at the time has borne out well, because if you look at the number now of 50,000 being killed, which I think is roughly accurate, that would mean that they had destroyed ISIS's forces basically 2 times over. And even though ISIS right now is collapsing, if they'd experienced that kind of attrition relative to their overall numbers, they would be collapsing much more quickly than they are.
Last point, is there something that the U.S. could add to its strategy that would be a definite benefit going forward in the new administration?
Well, with respect to ISIS, as the segment began, there's a lot of damage being done to them right now. They've lost 43% of their territory. They're on the verge of losing Mosul in Iraq, which has about 11% of their population, which will leave them with just one major capital. I think that there's 2 things, though, that can be done going forward. One of them is ISIS is going to try to regroup as an insurgent movement, not just in Syria and Iraq, but also in Africa. And being able to keep pressure on and maintain counterterrorism cooperation is important. A second thing is making sure that Sunni grievances don't basically reignite another major insurgency against Iraq. And unfortunately, all the components are in place. And then the final thing I'll point out is that al-Qaeda during all of this has been staying relatively low-key, but they're still very dangerous, and they're operating much more openly now than ever before. So batting back against al-Qaeda's newfound ability to operate openly is also important.
Daveed Gartenstein-Ross, this stuff is complex, and that's why we need you to help us understand the way through. Appreciate it. Allison.